Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the daily news analysis by SRIRAM'S IAS, where we take up the important articles featuring in the Hindu newspaper and break them down for our understanding from the UPSC examination point of view. So let's start our today's discussion by taking the important articles which feature in the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. So let's take up our first article for the day. The first article which appears in the newspaper reads, "Are data localization requirements necessary and proportionate?" So this particular article appears in the newspaper in the context of what is known as data localization. So through this article, we'll understand what exactly is data localization, what are the various debates and questions concerning data localization. So as this article also asks, are these requirements necessary and proportionate? So what is this debate all about? We'll try to understand that. So this becomes important for us from the perspective of GS3, where we have the various aspects of science and technology and economy as well. So let's dive right into it. What do we mean by data localization? So when we talk about data localization, at the heart of it obviously is the data. What do we mean by data? Data is anything that is stored in a computer resource. So it can be in various forms. And in this day and age today, this data has acquired humongous importance, where we saw there's a famous statement saying data is the new oil, which means that data is the new currency which is running the current world economy and is going to run the world economy in the coming future as well. So therefore this data is a currency, and therefore in order to the question of who holds this currency, who has a ownership of this currency, and who is handling this data is a very important question to ask. And to ask this question, the concept of data localization comes into place, where data localization simply means that whichever company which is taking the data from any consumer, it is supposed to store that data in that country or in that region from which it is acquiring that data from the consumer. And this mandatory requirement of storing the data in the country from which the data is being taken is known as data localization. So it refers to various policy measures that restrict data flows by limiting the physical storage and processing of data within a driven jurisdiction and boundaries. So to take an example of this, let's say that today I go to a mall and I make a credit card transaction to buy some product. So whenever I make that transaction, the data is being taken by the bank server and whichever servers which I'm using for making that card transaction. So if it's an international bank server, it will take my payment data, and that data will also go to that country where the parent server of this particular bank server is located. Generally, the country that major servers are located is in the United States of America. So this way, any transaction that is done in any one part of the country, the data travels to the place where the parent server is kept. So now data localization concept comes in place, wherein the country, so for example India, feels that the data that is taken out from their own country, they have a right to place that data and make the company store that data inside India only, where they should have the physical presence of the servers, and certain critical data should not be taken out from the country without India's permission. This is the whole ambit of data localization, and the ongoing tussle is on whether various countries are taking out their data localization laws, and there's increasing political tussle going on between various countries on with regards to this concept of data localization. So why now, as we saw, data is becoming the new currency. Let's look at the volume of the data that is transacted throughout the world. So as per the UN's Digital Economy Report 2021, 64.2 zettabytes of data were created in 2020, which is a 314% increase from the year 2015. In a mere span of 5 to 6 years, the volume of data that is created and transferred is gone up by 314%, and this is the voluminous size, 64.2 zettabytes, that is transacted throughout the world. So this shows us as to how the potential of transaction is data is not only increasing manifold, but it is only going to rapidly increase in the coming future. So therefore this data can be used to make decisions with economic impacts, environmental impacts or effects on health, education or society in general. Now, to take an example of this data usage again, the other day in our sessions we talked about as to how Facebook suffered a loss of $10 billion due to the Apple's privacy security policy, wherein the Facebook or Meta weren't able to track the users and therefore not able to collect critical data, and that impacted their ad revenue. So we can see as to how the data that is collected by these organizations from various consumers are of great value to them economically, and using this data there can be many decisions that can be made which impact not just economy but environment, health, education and society in general as well. So this is the backdrop with regards to data localization. Now coming to why is this data important? So this large collection of information about people's online habits has become an important source of profits. I just now explained via the Meta example. This is how the companies are using this data for their profits. So your online activity can expose a lot about who you are, and companies find it valuable to use the information to target advertisements, right? And therefore governments and political parties have also gained interest in these data sets for election and policy making. This is also an increasing trend that is being seen with respect to usage of data, where not just the corporate companies are using the data, but even political parties and governments are making use of this data to analyze citizen behavior, analyze what are their choices, how they can be manipulated, and therefore the usage of this data as to who is using them, whether or not it is being used in the right ethical ways or not, has gained much importance right now. So now where does this data localization concept come in then? So therefore many governments are thinking that whoever is collecting the data of the citizens of that particular country should store that data in the borders of those country compulsorily. This is the concept of data localization. Now, what are some of the global laws on data localization? So when we talk about India enacting a law on data localization, are there some other countries which have also taken a step towards it? So interestingly, there's a law known as European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Now this is a term which most of you must have heard in the past, because this GDPR or General Data Protection Regulation is a landmark regulation, one can say a landmark piece of law framed by the European Union, which was one of the earliest legislations deciding on privacy, data governance, data localization. So this piece of law also has provisions with respect to data localization, where it obligates the businesses in the EU, whichever company is operating in the European Union, to keep the data secured within the boundaries of the European Union. So the European Union already has a precedence of having data localization in its GDPR laws. Not just the EU, countries like Russia have a stricter regulation where it has stricter laws pertaining to the cross-border flow of data and emphasizes keeping data within the Russian Federation. So there are some countries which presently do have some certain provisions with respect to data localization. Now, what can be the benefits and counter impacts of having this data localization? So many experts, they advocate the concept of data localization, wherein they agree that yes, companies which are collecting data from one particular region should mandatorily store that data in that particular region, but there are also certain adverse impacts that are being talked about this move, wherein if the countries unnecessarily impede the process of business for these companies, it might so happen that it might create an adverse economic impact on these companies, and they might feel that the atmosphere to conduct business in this country is becoming unfavorable. So the ease of doing business might actually get converted to the unease of doing business. So that has been touted as the major potential adverse impact that can be caused with respect to data localization. So in this aspect, let's understand what are the arguments which are given in favor of enacting data localization, and then we look at what are some of the arguments that are given against, or that can be issues with respect to data localization. So when we talk about favor of data localization, or introducing a concept through a law of data localization into the country, there can be several advantages, such as India being one of the most powerful markets in terms of data creation and use. The need for data localization is essential. The simple fact wherein one can advocate that data localization should be present in India, because India is currently and also increasingly going to be more the most powerful markets, because the number of consumers who are there using these kind of devices, they are also high in India. Therefore, data creation and usage is very high in India, and therefore India is a very big market. And to regulate such a market, the concept of data localization becomes very essential. Then it will increase data accessibility, which means that if the data is stored within the country, the law enforcement agencies which might have to use this data, they would also be able to access this data. So it would help the Indian law enforcement access this user data, and this especially gained prominence when incidences of lynching across the country were linked to WhatsApp rumors whose stance on encrypted content frustrated government officials. So there are a lot of times where unwanted information is shared through these platforms, such as the WhatsApp platform, and in case a law enforcement agency wants to track this message, it is essential that the data is indeed stored within the country so that the law enforcement agency can access this data. So this is also given as one of the major advantages of having the data servers located inside the country. Then it would save the costs. So along with the government support, most domestic born technology companies, which tend to have heavy foreign investments, support data localization because most of these firms store their data exclusively in India. So it can benefit them with respect to their costs as well. Then it would result into privacy protection, where some Indian companies have strongly argued that data regulation for privacy and security will have little teeth without localization, citing models in China and Russia. So what this means is that in order to maintain the privacy of the consumers, whatever data that is collected through their devices, now to ensure security and privacy of their devices and data, it would only be possible when that data is located inside the country. If the data itself travels outside the country, the security and privacy with respect to that data cannot be really guaranteed, and that is why data localization is a must for maintaining privacy. So then it would also prevent snooping, which means that surveillance. Preventing surveillance, so secures citizens' data and provides data privacy and data sovereignty from foreign surveillance. So this is, for example, when Facebook allegedly shared user data with Cambridge Analytica to influence voting behavior in the US. This is cited as an example where the users' data were used for impacting citizens' behavior and even surveillance on them. Then another advantage is of employment generation. Now when the data servers will be created inside the country, new set of infrastructure would be created, and this would in turn, many argue that this would in turn lead to employment generation. However, there are certain critics which talk about the invalidity of this point, where they say that if the data centers and servers are coming up inside the country, most of them would be automated and less manpower would be required to man them, and that is why the employment generation point or the employment generation that would be created would not be that much. That is what many critics have to say on this point. Then it would ensure corporate accountability. This is a very major point, wherein those companies which are mandatorily having to store their data inside the country would ensure that they are being accountable, they are being held accountable for the actions that they're indulging into. So it would result into greater accountability from firms like Google, Facebook, etc. about the end use of the data, which minimizes conflict of jurisdiction due to the cross-border data sharing and delay in justice delivery in case of the data breach. So these are the set of advantages which can be said for having a data localization policy for India. Now, what can be some of the arguments that are given against the policy of data localization? So, as I mentioned earlier, the major impact that the policy of data localization can have is on the business behavior of these firms, where they might feel that they are being given additional layer of regulation, and this might hamper their mindset to do business, and it might result into unease of doing business. Then the major argument that is given against data localization is having a lack of unified global approach. Now this is a global concern, wherein if with regards to data localization, various countries start to have their own laws. So for example, the EU has their own law, Russia has their own data localization laws, India also starts to have their own data localization laws. What this would result into is a lack of unified approach, where no one country will have a single law, and this might cause confusion between various companies, and therefore global governance with respect to data will take a hit, which is a very big issue. Therefore, data localization is important, but there also has to be a global approach or a global framework with which the countries are operating. So since that won't be there, this would be a major issue. Then this would increase in operational costs for the companies. This is also a major factor, as I said, where if the companies are having to maintain extra servers inside the country, it would increase their operational costs, and therefore it would increase their cost for storage as well. Then there's an important point given with regards to data localization, which can become an issue, is of the domestic misuse of data, which means that the mandatory storing of the data inside the country, what can be promised that how can it be promised that this data is also used correctly, where it can also be possible that the data which is stored domestically, that can also be misused. So critics caution against state misuse and surveillance of the personal data. So there is danger to the data in here as well, and they also argue that security and government access is not achieved by localization. So it is said that apart from data localization, having robust systems and security measures to protect that data, that is also equally important when we talk about alongside data localization. So these are some of the arguments which are given against having data localization. But can this be solved, and can we have a way forward with this? The article talks about certain measures that we can take up as a way forward, which means that in this debate of whether or not to have a data localization policy to make the companies store their data inside the country and make them face the unease of doing business, the author suggests that the way forward with this is that first of all, we should have a multi-stakeholder approach, which means that there are various stakeholders with respect to data who are important. So be those the corporates, the governments, certain citizen groups, all these stakeholders who have an equal stake in regulating how the data is managed. First of all, they should be taken on board, and we should be having a multi-stakeholder approach. Then second important point which the authors suggest is about the glocalization. The issue which we talked about right now, that data localization also needs to have a globally unified policy with certain local specifications. This is known as glocalization, wherein you have one hand on the global approach, and the implementation is taken into mind the local interests. So it is one such method in the digital space wherein laws can be harmonized globally, but paying attention to the local interest. So this concept should be applied when we make laws with respect to data localization, not just for India but for the whole world as well. Then third important point is when we talk about whether or not to allow countries to store data, there can be categorization of data, which means that certain critical classified data should be mandatorily made to stored inside the country. So having made such categorization will help protect the critical data. Then we should be implementing proper budgeting and planning, and most important, the infrastructure development is very necessary. Just having the data localization laws won't be enough, but to have adequate, robust IT systems and the servers which would make possible the effective protection of data and storage of data is very important. So these are some of the measures that can be taken to realize this policy effectively. And in India, data localization has been advocated in the now withdrawn Data Protection Bill, and the B.N. Sri Krishna Committee, which was set up earlier the Data Protection Bill, it also advocated for data localization. So now it remains to be seen what kind of a policy India comes up with respect to this concept. So this was a discussion on this topic, and with this, let's move on to our next article for the day. The next article which appears in the newspaper reads, Population Criterion for New Eklavya Schools Impractical, says Parliamentary Panel. Now this particular article appears in the newspaper, which talks about the Eklavya Model Residential School Scheme. These are special schools which would be set up in especially to cater to the scheduled tribe population or the tribal population. Tribal students are to be the main focus area of these schools, where they would be given admission. It would be a type of residential schools headed by the government, which would impart them holistic education, which would take care of their primary and secondary education, and with that it would also try to give them vocational and have equal focus with respect to their extracurricular activities as well. This would follow the CBSE curriculum, and that is why these schools become important. But what is the article saying? What are some of the issues with respect to the Eklavya model schools? We'll try to understand what this whole scheme and the issues relating to it are. So What are these Eklavya Model Residential School Scheme? So as I said, this is a scheme to make schools for the tribal students. Therefore, it is implemented by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. And it is a scheme introduced in the year 1997 to 1998. This type of a scheme was introduced back in the year 1997-1998 to ensure tribal students get access to quality education in remote tribal areas. So the scheme was there since this time, and this had features such as school would focus to provide quality upper primary, secondary and senior secondary level education to the scheduled tribe students. And apart from school building, including hostels and staff quarters, provisions for a playground, students' computer lab, teacher resource room are also included in the model residential schools. But this scheme was revamped under the current dispensation government, wherein in 2018, the Union Cabinet revamped the scheme and made certain changes which meant that these model schools will be set up in every block with more than 50% ST population and at least 20,000 tribal persons. So this scheme was changed in a manner where these kind of schools should specifically come in those areas, those sub-districts which have the ST population is more than 50,000 and more than 20,000 tribal persons are living in this area, which means that this scheme wanted to target those areas which are dominated by the ST population. So this was the change that the Union government did in 2018. This would be implemented where there will be an autonomous society under the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, similar to the Navodaya Vidyalaya Samiti, to run the EMRS or the Eklavya Model Residential School Scheme. So what are the features of this new scheme now? So this EMRS is a scheme for making model residential schools for Indian tribals, right, across India, and it started in the year 97. We saw this, and this school follows the CBSE curriculum, and these model residential schools are being developed to impart quality education to tribal students with an emphasis on not only academic education but the all-round development of these tribal students. But what are some of the issues that are highlighted with respect to this scheme? So recently this year, there was a parliamentary standing committee on social justice which reviewed this particular scheme. So this parliamentary committee, we know that whenever there is a scheme or law that is passed in the parliament, the parliamentary committee is there to scrutinize that move, and it reviews the policy, it reviews the law and gives certain suggestions on it. So similarly, the parliamentary standing committee had its view on this, wherein it said that having such a criteria where the scheme would only be there in a region which has more than 50% ST population and 20,000 people in number is a impractical criteria to have. So they said that, pointing that this particular move is pertained with significant difficulties in identifying and acquiring lands in several districts, especially in forested or hilly areas where a contiguous 15-acre plot is hard to find. So the mandate of the scheme is that a 15-acre plot would be kept aside and the school, along with all its facilities, would be built on that land. The Parliamentary Standing Committee says that in all these sub-districts which have this many ST population, it is very difficult to identify this 15-acre land, and this criterion would also deprive the scattered ST populations of the benefit of these schools. So if one is saying that these schools should only come up in the ST dominated areas, what about those areas where the population of the scheduled tribe is scattered in nature? It might not benefit them. So these were some of the areas which the Parliamentary Standing Committee highlighted in this manner. So what are some of the other issues then with respect to its implementation? Now the number of schools. It was said that 688 model residential schools would come up, but out of these 688 that have been sanctioned so far, only a total of 230 schools are functioning from their own buildings, and of them 392 are totally functional, but only 230 have their own premises. So we can see that out of the 688 that were sanctioned, only 230 of them have their own premises, and nearly 390 are functional schools. Then, as per data presented by the government to the standing committee, which we talked about right now, a total of 232 sanctioned EMRS were yet to begin construction as well. So this is the state of the implementation of the schemes, where a large chunk of the model residential schools are yet to be constructed. And the major issue that is being felt with respect to acquiring the 15-acre land and constructing these schools, the news article highlights that where the population is met, those areas where the population is more than 50% ST population, the suitable land is not available. So as the parliamentary committee also flagged out that these areas are very remote areas and acquiring 15 acres is a very difficult task over here, and therefore much land is being acquired in the outskirts of the region. And even if land is getting available, there is legal acquisition of this land is taking time, and there are host of difficulties that are coming for the authorities when from the realization of the land to construction of the school. So these are the set of issues which are surrounding the Eklavya Model Residential School scheme. So this was a discussion on this topic, and with this let's move on to our next issue for the day. The next article which appears in the newspaper reads, "Extra regional fishing fleets present in the Indian Ocean, says the Navy." Now this particular article appears in the newspaper and talks about a very dangerous development that is happening in the Indian Ocean region. What is happening? There are a large number of more than 200 Chinese fishing vessels which were seen this year alone, and only 1/3 of them had license to do so. And not just the Chinese, other European nations' ships has also been seen in the Indian Ocean waters, especially in the northern Indian Ocean region. Now, why is this dangerous? Because these Chinese fishing vessels are not authorized to carry out fishing in these areas, and this concept is known as illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing. This is a concept which is recognized under the international maritime law, which says that that country is not allowed, a particular country is not allowed to carry out fishing activities other than its allotted areas. So therefore the Chinese do not have any business to carry out fishing in these particular areas, but the presence of these many Chinese fishing vessels in the Indian Ocean region is a worrisome trend, wherein they are not just violating the international maritime law and harming the marine environment, but this also sparks off certain strategic dangers, wherein we all know during the 26/11 attacks, the attackers who came to Mumbai came in a fishing vessel, and therefore the monitoring of these fishing vessels becomes very important, and one never can know that these vessels are being used for fishing purposes or for some other military or attack purposes. That is why the presence of these vessels is a very dangerous sign, and this presence is monitored by the Information Management and Analysis Center, or IMAC, and the Information Fusion Center, the Indian Ocean region. Both these institutes are located in Gurugram and they function from a similar facility. So these are the two organizations which monitor the presence of these vessels, and along with these fishing vessels, a dangerous presence is also seen of the Chinese deep sea trawlers. Now, what do we mean by deep sea trawlers? The deep sea trawlers are big ships which carry out fishing, but the speciality of them is that their nets are way deeper into the ocean beds, and therefore the fishes that their nets catch are not just of the fishes that they need, but certain unwanted fishes are also captured, and this results into harming the marine ecology and harming the balance of the fishes in the region. That is why the deep sea trawling is banned across various regions in the world, and it was seen that between 2015 and 2019, on an average, at least 500 Chinese deep sea trawlers were present in the Indian Ocean region. And this kind of fishing depletes the fish stocks, destroys marine habitats, puts fishermen at a disadvantage, and affects coastal communities, especially in the developing communities. That is why this concept of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing is a big cause of concern. Now, what are some of the international laws then which regulate this IUU fishing? There are various international and national instruments which India has indulged into. So the international laws, which is known as the UN clause or the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas. This is the premier instrument which deals with the international maritime law. So under the UN clause, it is said that every regional country has a right to make sure that it is protecting itself from the IUU type of fishing. So India has indulged into two such organizations. One is the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission and the Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which operate under the UN clause, and using these agreements, India protects its international waters with respect to protecting with such kind of fishing. Not just now these regional agreements, the Quad grouping, which has again India, Australia, Japan and the US. This Quad grouping also recently came up with an initiative to, it announced that last month an ambitious Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative to track dark shipping or the illegal fishing and to build a faster, wider and more accurate maritime picture of the near real-time activities in the partners' waters. So one such initiative has also been taken by the Quad group. And internationally, there are two agreements with respect to the IUU fishing. One is the Cape Town Agreement and second is the Agreement on Port State Measures. India is not yet a signatory to both these agreements. So these are some of the backdrop information with respect to the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. We come to the end of today's discussion over here and we'll meet again tomorrow with the important articles from the newspaper. Thank you.